The afternoon sun burned hot against the cracked pavement of a small suburban town where strangers passed each other without a glance. Cars slowed, eyes turned, then quickly looked away. In the middle of the sidewalk stood an old white man, frail, disoriented, one shoe untied, clutching a folded map that trembled in his shaking hands. His silver watch caught the sunlight like a final signal flare from a life that once mattered. But no one stopped. The man's suit, though fine, was wrinkled and dusty, his face pale beneath the strain of heat and confusion. The world around him moved in rhythm. The coffee drinkers, the office workers, the joggers, all pretending not to notice the lost figure interrupting their clean routine. Across the street, a young black teenager watched, sweat glistening on his brow from a long day of handing out flyers. His backpack sagged from the weight of books and responsibility far heavier than his years. The boy hesitated. People were staring, whispering, waiting for him to move. Then he did. The moment he crossed the street, the world seemed to pause. A silent collision between judgment and compassion. The old man's frail hand trembled as the boy reached for it. No one knew then that this single gesture, the hand of a black teen extended toward a forgotten white stranger, would change two lives and expose a secret worth billions. The moment their hands met, something wordless passed between them. Not pity, not charity, but recognition. The boy's grip was steady, grounding, while the old man's skin felt thin as paper, pulsing faintly with confusion and exhaustion. The summer wind carried the scent of car exhaust and blooming lilacs from the corner park. Around them, people slowed just long enough to watch, some frowning, others whispering, then kept walking, relieved that it wasn't their problem to solve. The teenager, whose name was Jamal, guided the man gently toward the shaded bench under a dying oak tree. He didn't know what had happened, only that the man looked lost, his eyes darting between buildings as if searching for something that no longer existed. Jamal had seen this street 1,000 times, cracked sidewalks, peeling paint on shop windows, and the same corner store owner who always kept one eye on him. It was the kind of neighborhood where kindness was often mistaken for weakness. Yet here he was, a 16-year-old boy, standing beside a man who had the look of someone who once commanded rooms full of power. The old man's suit told a story before his voice ever could. Custom stitching, faint scent of cologne long out of place here, and cufflinks shaped like tiny gold lions. But now those symbols of wealth were dulled by dust and sweat. His eyes, pale blue, unsteady, scanned the park with a quiet kind of panic. Jamal's instincts weren't born from trust. They were born from his grandmother's lessons about compassion. That sometimes, helping someone who would never help you is the most powerful rebellion there is. He fetched the man a bottle of water from a nearby vendor, using the last 2 crumpled bills in his pocket. As the man drank, a few workers on break glanced over, some shaking their heads. One muttered under his breath, smirking. But Jamal ignored it. Moments passed. The man's breathing steadied. He looked toward the buildings like a stranger in a city he once built. There was something haunting about it, the kind of loss that wasn't about memory but meaning. A gust of wind lifted a folded paper that had slipped from the old man's suit pocket. Jamal caught it before it blew away, an embossed letterhead from Lowell Industries, a name that meant nothing to him. But printed beneath it in faded blue ink was a signature that matched the engraved initials on the man's watch, C.R. Lowell. He didn't know it then, but that name had once been synonymous with power, the kind of power that shaped skylines and bank accounts. Yet here he sat, alone on a park bench, invisible to everyone except a teenage boy whose kindness would soon be dissected by headlines and judged by the world. That evening, Jamal walked him toward the edge of town, where the roads grew quieter and the houses older. The man followed with short, unsteady steps, still gripping the boy's hand as if afraid of disappearing again. The neighborhood lights flickered on, casting long orange shadows across their path. It looked almost poetic, the powerful and the powerless walking side by side, not knowing how close their stories were about to intertwine. When they reached the corner diner, the man gestured weakly toward it. Jamal helped him inside, guiding him to a booth. The waitress looked up, confused but soft-hearted enough to serve them both. Jamal stayed until the man finished his soup, then helped him stand again. He didn't see the black car that had been parked across the street the whole time. Tinted windows, engine idling, someone inside watching closely. The old man's life was about to be found. The boy's life was about to be changed. The world, for once, was about to notice both. The black car across the street idled for a long moment after Jamal and the old man stepped inside the diner. Its tinted windows hid the faces within, but not their purpose. Cameras clicked behind glass. Phones whispered data to servers. Somewhere in that moment, Jamal unknowingly stepped into the kind of story that doesn't stay local. It spreads like wildfire. Inside, the diner's fluorescent lights buzzed softly. The smell of coffee and fried onions hung heavy. The waitress refilled water glasses, glancing now and then toward the odd pair, a frail, pale-skinned man in a dusty designer suit and a teenage boy in worn sneakers and a faded t-shirt. The contrast was almost cinematic. Jamal sat across from him, watching quietly. The man, C.R. Lowell, had barely touched his soup. His eyes stared through the window as if he were trying to remember what city he was in. Each spoonful trembled slightly, hand shaking. Not from hunger, but from the exhaustion of being lost. Not just physically, but spiritually. The news would later describe him as a missing billionaire found wandering aimlessly in the wrong part of town. But in that moment, he was just an old man trying to hold on to a world that had slipped away. Outside, the black car pulled off slowly, disappearing around the corner. That night, Jamal walked him to a nearby bus stop. The street lamps hummed, the pavement glowed faintly with heat. When the bus came, the old man didn't get on. He simply looked at Jamal for a long moment, a gaze of confusion mixed with something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. When Jamal finally got home, his grandmother was sitting by the window, radio humming softly. She looked up, saw the dust on his shoes, the exhaustion in his face, and asked nothing. Some questions don't need answers when kindness is written in the body. He slept soundly that night, unaware that by morning, the world would know his name. By dawn, the story had spread. A local delivery driver had snapped a photo of Jamal guiding the lost old man by the hand. It had been uploaded to a community page under the caption, "This kid helped a man everyone else ignored." No one knew yet that the man in the photo was Charles Richard Lowell, billionaire CEO of Lowell Industries, a company with holdings in real estate, energy, and pharmaceuticals. A man who had vanished 2 days ago from his gated mansion after a suspected stroke. The photo went viral overnight. Within hours, hashtags trended. News vans rolled into the neighborhood, their bright lights and satellite dishes scattering pigeons from rooftops. Reporters called Jamal a hero. Others called him lucky. Some questioned whether it was staged. But the boy himself didn't care for any of it. He hadn't done it for cameras. He'd done it because it was right. Still, the world doesn't let purity exist untested. As Lowell's family and lawyers reclaimed him, headlines shifted from local teen saves billionaire to billionaire's estate questioned after rescue. Journalists dug into Lowell's finances and found discrepancies. Shell companies, missing donations, unpaid workers. The irony was brutal. The man whose name gleamed on hospitals and scholarships had been losing not just his memory, but his morality long before his disappearance. And in every image that appeared online, there was Jamal, the boy whose simple kindness had cracked open a hidden empire. Days passed. Reporters came to the school. They followed him home. They filled his grandmother's porch with flashing cameras. She tried to turn them away, but kindness rarely protects you from curiosity. Meanwhile, Lowell recovered in a private hospital. But something had changed in him. The memory of that moment, the rough hand of a boy who treated him with dignity when others turned away, stuck like an anchor in the fog of his mind. He began asking questions about his company, about his estate, about why his name, once spoken with admiration, now drew silence in rooms of power. Jamal didn't know that while he sat at his grandmother's kitchen table, finishing homework by candlelight during a power outage, lawyers and executives were panicking. The lost old man had come back seeing clearly for the first time in years, and he remembered the kindness of a child more vividly than the contracts of his board. Lowell's family wanted control. They wanted silence. They didn't want a boy from a poor neighborhood being credited with saving their patriarch. But the truth had already escaped. The story had become a mirror, forcing a society obsessed with appearances to face its own reflection. People debated it online. Some praised Jamal as a symbol of hope. Others twisted it into politics and race. If the roles were reversed, one headline said, would the world still care? But Jamal didn't see any of that. He still walked the same route to school, past the same shops where people now stared longer than before. Some smiled kindly. Others muttered that he was just lucky. The world can't decide whether to lift you up or drag you down when your kindness exposes its hypocrisy. Then, one morning, a black car, the same kind as before, stopped in front of his house. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a letter sealed with the Lowell family crest. The letter wasn't from the lawyers. It was from Charles R. Lowell himself. Inside were only a few words, handwritten with shaky penmanship, and a small folded document with Jamal's name on it. The note read, "You reminded me what it means to see." The document was a scholarship, not a token gesture, but full tuition to the best university in the state, paid in full. It came with no conditions, no publicity, no press release, just gratitude. But when the media found out, they spun it again. Now he was the boy who saved the billionaire and got paid for it. They missed the point entirely. Kindness isn't a transaction. It's a light. And for one brief moment, that light burned through the noise of wealth, power, and prejudice, revealing something human beneath it all. The story refused to die. Even after the scholarship, after Lowell's recovery, after the headlines faded into newer scandals, the image of Jamal holding the billionaire's hand remained, a haunting emblem of something people couldn't quite define. It wasn't just a story about kindness anymore. It was a confrontation, a mirror held up to a world that wanted to celebrate compassion only when it was convenient. Weeks later, the truth began to surface. Investigations into Lowell Industries uncovered years of unethical labor practices, factories overseas underpaid, safety violations ignored, and executives pocketing millions. Lowell's own children had kept him in the dark, feeding him curated reports while his name became a shield for corruption. His philanthropy had been hollow, his legacy a castle built on denial. When the truth broke, it wasn't lawyers who stood beside him. It was Jamal. Cameras flashed as the old man arrived at the courthouse. Thinner now, walking with a cane. The boy quietly pushing his wheelchair when fatigue overtook him. People whispered, why was he helping the man whose empire had thrived on injustice? But Jamal understood something they didn't. Redemption doesn't erase wrong. It redefines what comes after. Inside, Lowell faced his former board members, his children, and a wall of reporters. His voice shook as he took responsibility, not for every misdeed, but for his blindness. He spoke of what it meant to lose everything and be saved by someone the world still refused to see as equal. The silence that followed was the kind that humbles nations. Jamal sat quietly in the front row, his grandmother beside him, her hands folded tightly. The words were heavy, but she knew this wasn't about money or fame anymore. This was about truth, about what happens when compassion collides with history, when an act of mercy becomes an indictment of a culture that sees color before humanity. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered. Some carried signs demanding justice for exploited workers. Others held banners praising Jamal. The air was alive with conflict, gratitude and resentment tangled together. For every person inspired by his kindness, there was another who resented how easily the story turned him into a symbol. And yet, symbols have power. A week later, Lowell invited Jamal and his grandmother to his estate. The mansion that once represented greed now stood quiet, stripped of servants and excess, dust gathered where marble had once gleamed. In the center of the great hall, Lowell waited, not as a billionaire, but as a man confronting the weight of his own choices. He showed them a new document, not a will, not a gift, but a foundation. The Lowell Truth Initiative. Its first mission to build scholarships for underprivileged students and fund community centers in neighborhoods like Jamal's. The signatures at the bottom weren't just Lowell's, Jamal's. Name was there too. Co-founder. It wasn't charity. It was partnership, a bridge between guilt and growth, between two lives that had collided by chance but continued by choice. The announcement went viral again, of course. Some mocked it as performative. Others saw it as progress. But the true transformation wasn't on screens. It was in the way Lowell looked at Jamal, not as a savior or a symbol, but as an equal. A few months later, at the foundation's first event, Jamal took the stage. He didn't read from notes. He didn't thank the cameras or politicians. He just told the truth about that day on the sidewalk when everyone else looked away. He spoke about how people measure worth by wealth, by skin, by silence, and how those measurements fail us every time. He said that the hardest part of doing good isn't the act itself, but living in a world that questions why you did it. The audience, filled with both the powerful and the forgotten, listened. The billionaire sat among them, tears quietly tracing the wrinkles of a man who had once been untouchable. When Jamal finished, there was no applause at first, only quiet, the kind that feels sacred. Then, one by one, hands began to rise, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. For the first time, the story wasn't about color or charity or saving anyone. It was about seeing a lost man who had built walls out of privilege and a boy who tore them down with a single act of humanity. Seeing a system that broke people and a moment that dared to heal it. That night, as the crowd dispersed, Lowell stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. The reflection staring back wasn't the billionaire from magazine covers. It was an old man who had been lost and found by grace. Behind him, Jamal lingered for a moment before leaving, the two exchanging a glance, not of gratitude, but mutual understanding. The kind only those who've walked through judgment together can share. Outside, the air was cool, the sky deep orange, fading into dusk. For the first time in a long time, the city felt awake, as if every unseen act of kindness was now illuminated by what had happened between them. And somewhere, in the hum of night traffic, it felt as though the world had learned, even if just for a moment, that compassion is the truest kind of wealth. The evening breeze carried a gentle calm over the city that once ignored an old man on the street. The sun dipped low, painting the skyline in gold and rose, washing the towers and rooftops in a light that seemed to forgive everything for just a moment. Inside a small community center, one that stood on land once owned by Lowell Industries, a new sign gleamed above the entrance. The Lowell Jamal Foundation for Human Dignity. The building buzzed with life. Children laughed in classrooms where volunteers taught art, math, and hope. Posters spoke not of donations, but of stories, moments when one person chose to see another. The photos on the walls weren't of billionaires or politicians. They were of faces that once went unnoticed: janitors, delivery drivers, bus attendants, single mothers, and one teenage boy whose kindness had changed the course of a life. Jamal stood near the back of the hall, taller now, his presence quieter but stronger. He was 21, studying sociology, splitting his time between classes and the foundation he helped build. Every so often, he still thought of that afternoon. The heat, the noise, the silence that had surrounded the old man as the world pretended not to see. Now, that silence had been replaced by voices, real ones. Across the room, an older Charles Lowell sat in a wheelchair by the window watching the sunset. His body had grown frail, but his eyes had gained the kind of peace that can only come from losing everything and finding truth in its ashes. On his lap rested an open notebook, the same kind Jamal used to carry years ago. Inside, he scribbled ideas for new programs, scholarships, and housing projects. He didn't speak much anymore. He didn't have to. His presence was enough. When Jamal approached, Lowell looked up with a faint smile. It was the same smile from that day, only now it wasn't lost. It was grateful. They didn't need words. Their story had already said everything worth hearing. Later that night, after everyone left, Jamal stood outside under the flickering streetlight, looking at the mural painted across the building's brick wall. It showed a scene that millions had once scrolled past on their phones, a young black boy holding the hand of a lost white man. Above them, in bold white paint, the words read, "When no one else will, you can." The world had changed, but not completely. There were still stares, still bias, still injustice. But stories like his had begun to shift something subtle. The way people paused before judging. The way strangers looked a little longer, perhaps remembering that compassion could belong to anyone. Some called him a hero. He never accepted that title. Heroes save the world. He had just reached out his hand. Months later, when Lowell passed away peacefully in his sleep, his final will surprised everyone. He left the majority of his remaining wealth not to his children, not to shareholders, but to the foundation. In his letter, made public by his attorney, he wrote, "I spent a lifetime building walls of glass and concrete, thinking that wealth could protect me from being forgotten. But one boy taught me that the only fortune worth keeping is humanity. What I once owned, I now return to those who deserve to be seen." The letter went viral, but Jamal never gave interviews. The press tried to revive the story, but for him, it had already ended long ago. That moment when he held the hand of a stranger and decided that kindness was worth the risk. Years later, children would walk past that mural and ask their teachers about it, and the story would be told again, not as a tale of a billionaire and a boy, but as a lesson about vision. About how sometimes the richest man in the world is the one who has nothing left but a chance to make things right. And the poorest? The one who sees suffering and walks away. The foundation grew, spanning cities, teaching empathy as much as economics. Jamal led workshops where he asked one question that lingered in the air long after each session ended. If you saw someone invisible to the world, would you see them? There was no right answer, only reflection. And maybe that was the point. One evening, standing on the rooftop of the center, Jamal watched the horizon glow in the distance. The city hummed beneath him, busy, restless, alive. He thought of his grandmother's words, whispered long ago, "Helping someone who'd never help you back. That's how heaven keeps score." He smiled faintly. Because in a world obsessed with gain, he had learned the one truth that would outlast wealth, race, and history. That sometimes one small act of kindness can rebuild the conscience of an entire civilization. And though no one else may remember the noise of that day, the cars, the stairs, the silence, the world would forever remember the light that came after, the light that began with a single hand, reaching out